in a small desert town of the American frontier. Whispers carried faster than the wind, sharper than any knife. Life was hard, and survival meant everything. Families worked the land, prayed for rain, and counted children as their greatest blessing. But for Clara, blessings never came. She had been married once, hopeful, but years passed with no child to hold in her arms. What should have been met with sympathy was instead met with suspicion. The townsfolk began to see her not as a woman of flesh and blood, but as a curse to be feared, avoided, and judged. Every sideways glance carved into her spirit, every whispered insult pressed like thorns into her skin. At church, she sat alone. At the marketplace, mothers drew their children close, as if her shadow itself carried misfortune. She endured quietly, carrying her sorrow like a stone inside her chest. But gossip in a small town never dies quietly. It grows like fire in the wind, and soon their judgment turned to cruelty. On a blistering summer afternoon, when the earth cracked beneath the sun, they decided her presence was no longer to be endured. Blinded by superstition and fear, the townsfolk gathered in cruel agreement. They dragged Clara to the edge of the barren desert just beyond the town. The sand was hot, nearly burning through her shoes, and her cries echoed across the empty land. But no plea softened their hearts. They called her barren, cursed, unworthy of their company. And in that madness of judgment, they condemned her. With rough hands and merciless shovels, they forced her into the ground, burying her up to her neck. Each handful of dirt pressed heavier against her ribs, stealing her breath and crushing her spirit. The sun hung mercilessly above, an unforgiving overseer. Sweat burned her eyes, and the dry desert air tore at her lips. Dust swirled around her face, mixing with tears until she could barely see. Her skin blistered beneath the heat, her throat too dry to call out again. Hours seemed to stretch into lifetimes, and the cruel laughter of the townsfolk faded into silence as they left her to the mercy of the elements. Clara's heart pounded, each beat echoing the truth that she would be left to die alone, forgotten beneath the vast, empty sky. Her head drooped as exhaustion claimed her, but despair fought to keep her awake. Every thought carried a memory, her mother's gentle hands brushing her hair, the sound of rain against the roof in her childhood home, the fleeting smile of the husband who had once held hope with her. Now, there was only sand, sun, and silence. Just as her eyes flooded closed, surrendering to darkness, another sound broke through the steady, deliberate thud of boots against the earth. Clara's pulse quickened. Someone was coming. Through blurred vision, she saw a tall figure moving closer, a shadow against the burning horizon. It was a cowboy, rugged and strong, with broad shoulders that carried the weight of more than years of ranch work. His face was sun-worn, marked by a life of struggle and solitude. His name was James, though Claire did not yet know it. His weathered eyes held a depth she recognized a pain, but also resolve. He was a widower, a man who had known loss so heavy it nearly broke him. And now, standing before her half-buried form, he saw not a curse but a woman in desperate need. His jaw tightened, and without a word, he knelt beside her. James dropped to his knees, his hands immediately clawing at the hardened earth. The desert's oil was packed tight, each handful stubborn and dry, but he dug without hesitation. The grit tore at his palms, raising blisters and drawing blood, yet he pressed on. Clara's breathing quickened as the pressure against her chest slowly eased with every scoop of dirt he removed. The sun still bore down mercilessly, sweat dripping from his brow, but his determination did not falter. Each movement was an act of defiance against the cruelty she had endured, a promise that she would not be left to die. Clara tried to speak, her cracked lips forming broken words, but her voice was barely a whisper. James paused only long enough to meet her eyes, and in them, she saw something she hadn't known in years: a compassion. It steadied her, kept her from slipping fully into despair. With renewed energy, he pressed harder, faster, his muscles straining with every handful of dirt he cast aside. The silence of the desert was broken only by the ragged sound of his breath, the scrap of his hands against stone and sand, and Clara's faint, shallow gasps as life slowly returned to her lungs. The ground finally gave way, loosening around her shoulders. James slid his arms beneath her fragile frame and lifted her gently, as though she weighed nothing at all. Clara trembled against him, her body weak and battered, her face streaked with dirt and tears. He wrapped his worn coat around her, shielding her from the harsh wind that had begun to rise across the plain. She clung to him, too faint to speak, but the look in her eyes carried 1,000 unspoken words of gratitude. For the first time in years, Clara felt a hand that did not push her down, but pulled her up. James held her close, his heart heavy with anger at what had been done to her, yet soft with the determination to protect her now. He rose, carrying her toward the waiting silhouette of his horse standing a few yards away. Each step across the desert felt like a declaration that she would not be abandoned again. The vast horizon stretched endlessly before them, but for Clara, it no longer seemed empty. She was no longer trapped in silence and judgment. She had been seen, rescued, and given the fragile gift of hope. And for James, a widower burdened by grief, saving her sparked the beginning of something he thought he had lost forever. James lifted Clara free from the earth, wrapping his coat gently around her trembling shoulders. She could barely stand, her legs weak from hours of being trapped, but his arms were strong and steady. He carried her toward his horse, whispering softly that she was safe now, words she had not heard in what felt like a lifetime. His voice was low, almost broken, but filled with conviction. Clara leaned into him, too exhausted to speak, yet her heart held on to every syllable. In that fragile moment, safety no longer felt like a dream, but something real. The horse snorted softly as James lifted her into the saddle. He mounted behind her, one arm firmly around her to keep her steady. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, the horizon glowing red with the setting sun. The ride was long, the air cooling as night crept in, but James never let go of her hand. His presence was a silent vow, unspoken yet undeniable. For Clara, every hoofbeat carried her further from pain, closer to something she had never dared imagine, of freedom, and perhaps even belonging. When they reached his quiet ranch, the night sky shimmered with stars above them. The house stood sturdy, simple yet warm, surrounded by the faint silhouette of wooden fences and fields waiting for morning light. Clara's heart trembled at the sight of it. Was nothing like the cold homes of the townsfolk who had condemned her. James dismounted first, then lifted her carefully into his arms once more, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the scent of aged wood and the crackle of the hearth welcomed them, a stark contrast to the barren silence she had endured. James guided her to a chair near the fire, setting her down gently as though she were fragile glass. He fetched water and bread, urging her to eat, but more than the food it was his kindness that nourished her. For the first time in years, she felt seen, and not as a curse, not as a barren woman, but simply as Clara. Her hands trembled as she ate, not from hunger alone but from the overwhelming realization that she was no longer alone. James sat close, his eyes soft yet distant, carrying the weight of a grief he rarely shared. He had once known love, once held joy in his arms, but death had stolen his wife and child, leaving him with an emptiness no words could heal. The ranch had grown quiet since then, a place of work but not of laughter. Yet now, with Clara beside him, something shifted. He saw not just her suffering, but her strength, her will to live despite the cruelty of others. To him, she was not barren, she was a survivor, and in her, he recognized the same brokenness he carried. Two wounded souls, drawn together by fate's rough hand. Days turned into weeks, and Clara slowly grew stronger. The bruises on her skin faded, but the deeper wounds of her spirit healed more gently. Each morning, she rose with the sun, helping James with simple tasks around the ranch. She gathered eggs, stirred pots of stew, and hung laundry beneath the wide, open sky. It was work, yes, but it was also freedom. No one whispered behind her back, no one pointed or condemned. Silence here was not punishment, it was peace. The ranch was alive with birdsong and the sound of the wind brushing across tall grass. One evening, Clara prepared a meal by the hearth. The firelight danced against the walls, casting shadows that felt more like companions than threats. James sat nearby, polishing his tools, watching her quietly. When she placed the food on the table, he caught her hand before she could pull away. "This house hasn't known laughter in a long time," he said softly, his voice rough with unspoken memories. Clara looked into his eyes, seeing the same loneliness she had carried for so long. And when they shared that meal, something unexplainable passed between them, something tender, fragile, but real. James began to speak more in the evenings, sharing fragments of his past. His late wife, the child they had lost, the nights he spent staring at an empty cradle. Clara listened with quiet understanding, her own pain resonating with his. She never judged, never pitied. Instead, she offered presence, a rare gift in a world that had taken so much from both of them. Slowly, he found himself smiling again, small at first, then deeper as the days went by. The walls of his grief cracked, letting in light that he thought he had buried forever. Clara too began to change. Where once she saw herself as worthless, she now saw purpose. She tended the garden James had long neglected, planting herbs and flowers with careful hands. She sewed curtains for the windows, softening the rugged ranch house with touches of care. For every task she completed, James's gratitude grew. He saw her not as a burden but as a partner, someone who brought life where there had been only silence. And as the weeks passed, Clara realized she had found something greater than acceptance, as she had found a home where her soul could breathe. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the prairie, James stood beside Clara on the porch. The land stretched wide and golden, endless in its beauty. "Out here," he said, his voice steady, "the world is big enough for second chances." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they were not born of sorrow. For the first time, she believed his words. The barren woman and the grieving cowboy had found each other not through fortune, but through survival. And in that vast, open land of America, where the sky stretched endlessly, they were no longer broken pieces, they were whole.